Hello everybody, today I'm finally getting around to my review of the BvS Knightmare Batman from the DC Multiverse line. I was initially very hesitant about whether to pick this figure up at all because although it has a very cool look, this version of the character only appears very briefly in Batman vs Superman in the dream sequence. And there is a follow-up sequence in Zack Snyder's cut of Justice League, but still, this is very minimal screen time, and we're not given an awful lot of context. We would have really seen this version of the character, or this look on the character, come to fruition a lot more, presumably in Justice League 2, although sadly we'll never really know now. So it seemed like a bit of an odd variant for me to invest in since he has very little screen time. But in the end, what swung it for me was a discounted price, and I have to admit I really do like that trench coat, adding a splash of colour to this figure. So I plumbed for it, and I must admit I do really like having all the different Batman movie variants in my collection. So on with the review, and as ever, we'll kick off by taking a look at the packaging. Now, this is the standard DC Multiverse packaging. It's very boxy. It's a little bit oversized, actually, for the contents inside the figure, but there's nothing wrong with that per se. Where I do take issue with this line, though, is just how minimal it is in terms of colour and images, and so it's a lot of black borders here. A fantastic window display where we see the figure, and that's what it's all about, but it does feel a little bit drab and a little bit dull. McFarlane do shake things up a little bit though when we look at the side panel, because usually this is just a black border with the name of the character and nothing else, but they've put a bit more effort into this one. There's actually a splash of colour here, which does make a difference. It's still not quite what I plumbed for. I would rather have a nice image here, either taken from the film or an illustration or a photo of the figure even. If this is still a bit on the dull side in the sense that it's just largely text, but what I will give them credit for is that we're actually seeing this gold effect here, and I do like that we have the BvS logo there at the top of the packaging. And then on the reverse of the packaging, we have this still taken from the film, which is very cool. This looks like a production shot. I like this. It's quite moody and atmospheric. And of course, it's a good image of the character. Would I prefer a full body? Yeah, but I'm nitpicking. At least this is more the kind of thing I was hoping to see on my side panel. And this is largely text-free, so I have to give them credit for that. This is nice and clean and quite displayable. So, looking at the figure itself, I have to say it certainly cuts a really interesting visual image, and I really like this splash of colour that is given by the trench coat. But if we start off by taking a look at the head sculpt as a likeness comparison, it doesn't really work for me. It's not bad, certainly not at this scale, but it's also not really sharp either. The sculpt feels almost too aquiline for this version of Batman, and the cowl isn't quite right in some of its proportions either. Even the ears seem a little bit too large at this angle. The other thing that strikes me is just how clean this is, and that's really coming from the face detailing in terms of the stubble that isn't really present in any of the paint apps, which is a real shame because obviously this version of Batfleck is particularly gruff, and I think they needed to have that here because it just looks a bit incongruous for this version of the character. Having said that, though, there's some fantastic sculpting, all new sculpting, I think, and tooling on the actual torso and, of course, this trench coat for the Batman. This is very specific to this version of the character, and it looks really detailed. And there's some fantastic paint apps here, really drawing out that detail. A nice wash running over that main suit there, and even on the bat symbol to really make this look dirty, used, worn, and very distinctive. And I think this works really well. The trench coat itself is also very nicely produced, some decent detailing in here to give that sort of leathery effect, which is nice. It's probably a little bit brighter than it appears in the film in all honesty, but then that is quite a saturated shot, so to be fair, maybe this is what the costume looks like before the effects and the filters. There's not a lot of colour here, not a lot in the way of paint apps, I should say, at the top of the coat though, but however, as we go down, we can see that they've added some of this sort of mud effect, this sort of worn dirt effect towards the bottom, and that sort of gently cascades or fades in, which I think is really good. And I'm really glad they put in this extra thought and detail. This works really well and salvages what could have been quite a bland trench coat effect. There's not a lot of detail when it comes to the arms or the gauntlets. It's pretty standard Batman fare. Again, not much in the way of washes here either. But we can see there's a fair amount of detail going on in terms of his cargo pants. We can see various different belts there and different straps and things. And for the most part, there is a nice light wash over this. This gives it a little bit more depth and texture than we'd usually expect to see in a McFarlane Toys figure, so this looks pretty good to me. And likewise, that extends all the way down the legs into those kneecaps and into the boots, where it just looks a little bit more visually interesting. There's just a bit more detail, a bit more colour here, which makes this all in all a very attractive looking figure. Moving on to articulation, there is a ball joint at the top of the neck there, allowing the head to rotate 360 degrees. It can lean left and right a pretty healthy distance, and it can nod up and down as well, particularly when it comes to looking up. That's actually quite impressive for a Batman figure. There's another ball joint in the shoulder. In fact, this may well be a butterfly wing joint, but I'm not really able to see that because of the trench coat. There's a complementary bicep swivel, of course, a double pin at the elbow, which is fantastic. I mean, you can get that lower forearm all the way to the head there. And of course, there's another ball joint at the wrist, which is, a bit tricksy, to be honest. I'm not a huge fan of the joints that McFarlane Toys use in this regard. Then there's another two ball joints in the torso, one at the waist and one in the upper chest area, which is absolutely fantastic, meaning you can rotate this figure side to side, but you can also lean him left and right a really huge distance. This is really quite surprising, especially with that trench coat. Now, he can bend forwards and technically backwards, although really he's only going to stand up straight, but he can bend forwards at least. There's a hinge in the hips, so the legs will kick out to the side. It won't really move side to side, unfortunately, but it will kick forwards and it will kick backwards a little bit, although I was actually surprised by how limited this is when it comes to going forwards. It's much better leaning backwards, oddly enough. There's a double pin at the knee, so that lower leg will kick all the way back there. Of course, you're going to be fighting the trench coat, though, so something to be aware of. And then there's the really weird foot articulation that McFarlane have, where it's kind of a swivel, it's also a hinge, and it also kind of pivots a little bit as well, and then there is some toe articulation. Looking at his accessories, he comes with a pair of goggles and a pair of binoculars. The goggles are quite interesting. Obviously, as a separate piece, they do slide over his head and they're quite tight fitting. They're nicely sculpted and there's actually some decent paint apps on them as well. And the actual goggles in the film are clearly very large, but even so, on the figure, these look a little bit clunky and a bit too chunky. And I'm not really sure you can really pull them over his eyes per se. They're clearly meant to be worn on his head, but it just looks a little bit, I don't know, a little bit out of proportion, and as I said, a bit clunky really. And I think perhaps they might have been better actually just sculpting these goggles onto the top of his head. The binoculars, on the other hand, are very, very basic. They're decently sculpted, but very low level. There's no attempt whatsoever to create the effect of lenses at the end of the binoculars. So it's just one chunky black plastic piece. No shading. Very, very limited in terms of sculpting. It's a prop and it's fine, but it's nothing to write home about. Having said that, he can grip them in his hand if you persevere. It's quite a tight grip, but that works really well actually from being able to hold them. And as you can see, he can actually get them up to his eyes, which is great. So it does look the part. Now, before I wrap up for today, I did want to just put this Knightmare Batman side by side with another Batfleck figure from the same toy company. So here we have the Justice League Tactical Suit Batman, which I'm hoping to cover in a video very soon, so you can see how they measure up and scale. In fact, it looks as if, to me, that the Knightmare Batman is fractionally taller than the Tactical Suit Batman. I don't know if that's intentional or that's an oversight. I'm not sure if that's accurate, but I just thought it'd be worth pointing out. So, final thoughts from me. I'm going to give this figure 4 stars because I think overall it's actually very, very impressive. It's got a lot going for it. I think it represents a brand new sculpt. I don't think we've seen many of these elements ever before, which is really, really good. He's visually very interesting. Obviously, having that sort of caftan and the duster or the trench coat, whatever you want to call it, makes him visually very different to anything else we have in the movie line of Batman figures, which I think is absolutely brilliant. I think he looks the part, and there's some nice detailing and actually some really good paint apps, particularly on the body and the torso of this figure, which is really impressive. And I think he definitely looks the part. There's some weaknesses here, so what stops it from being a 5-star figure? Well, it would be in terms of the sculpting on the face, as we talked about earlier on. It's not quite accurate enough for my liking. The accessories it comes with are a little bit bland, a bit basic, and maybe a bit clunky as well. And there's a little bit of articulation issue, I think, hindered by the trench coat, but to be fair, you kind of expect that. But all in all, this is a really fun figure. Actually, far surpassed my expectations. I wasn't expecting much from this figure, and he actually is really very welcome in the collection. And for me, it's another fantastic addition to what is becoming a pretty definitive collection of movie Batman figures from McFarlane Toys. They've pretty much got every variant out there now, which is pretty cool. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please do consider giving the video a like. That kind of thing really does help the channel out and it allows me to keep making more content. And if you're interested in seeing more content, remember to hit subscribe, as there'll be plenty more videos coming soon.